Hello, my name is Tammy Rose, and welcome to Concord Days. I'd like to open with a quote from a book called Complicity. This is what poet John Greenleaf Whittier called Lowell, a city springing up like the enchanted palaces of the Arabian tales. And I'm going to hand this off to Richard, my co-host. Hi,
Hi,
Richard.
Tammy. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. We've got another guest from Lowell this week. We've had lots of Lowellians lately, and today I would like to introduce you to Dick Howe Jr., a Lowell historian and the Register of Deeds for Middlesex County North. Hi, Dick. How are you?
Good. Hello, Richard. Hi, Tammy. Thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure to have you here as well. Welcome to Concord Days. So we'll be talking about Concord kind of, but I think we're going to stick with Lowell this week because that's your area of expertise. And you are the Register of Deeds for Middlesex County North. That does not include Concord, does it?
It doesn't. It's a asymmetrical split of the county because there's 54 cities and towns in Middlesex County, and only 10 of them are in the Northern District. It's Billerica, Carlisle, Chelmsford, Drake, Dunstable, Lowell, Tewksbury, Tingsboro, Westford, and Wilmington.
Those just roll off the tongue for you, right?
Right.
And you're probably intimate with every one of those places, aren't you?
Well, certainly their land ownership records.
Right. So yours is an elected position, correct?
It is. It's long been an elected position. That originated back in the 17th century, and I think it has something to do with the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution in England, because what happened was when the king got overthrown over there was already English settlements here, and his successor gave ownership rights to the land to his pals, and there was a lot of disputes about who owned what, and that is as the 17th rolled into the 18th century, and I think that property owners wanted somebody local who they could select through election to be the adjudicator of land titles. So I think that's the origin of it as an elected position.
Well, and it seems like a really great day job for a historian. Like, which one came first, your interest in history or that position?
Well, no, I've been interested in history for as long as I remember. I think growing up, my father, he actually taught history early on in his career in high school. So I think that was part of it. But I'm an attorney, and so for about 10 years before I was registered deeds, I practiced mostly criminal law. And this sounds kind of strange, but the reason I'm registered deeds is because too many of my clients were going to jail. And,
wow.
So I was doing mostly court-appointed criminal work, and it was back in the early 1990s when that was the age of mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. And I just had this succession of clients they were drug addicts, and they might sell drugs to feed their habit, but they were facing substantial jail sentences. They would have gotten less time in jail if they had robbed a bank with a gun than they would if they sold a bag of heroin to an undercover police officer. And so I always remember in the spring of 1994 walking back to my law office and saying, I just have to do something different. I picked up a newspaper and it said registered deeds to not seek re-election. And that's what, and I ran. There were 9 of us in the Democratic primary, and I won by 8 votes out of 25,000 that were cast. So that's how my career launched. That was back in 1994. And I have to say, I knew a lot more about hanging chads before Al Gore and George Bush faced off in Florida in 2000, because 3 of the communities in my district had punch card ballots, and we had recounts in all of them. So I learned a lot about that process.
So as the Register of Deeds, obviously you're surrounded by all kinds of great artifacts, paper artifacts, deeds, going back to what, the beginning of Lowell, or the beginning of the towns that you're dealing with?
So actually, the oldest record we have is from 1629.
Wow.
That's not, the artifact itself is not from then, because one of the features of registries of deeds in Massachusetts is we've never kept the original documents. We've only kept an official copy. And so the registry deed system grew up here in the 17th century. And I think it was because you had a deed to your house, and for any number of reasons, your house would burn down, whether it was a chimney fire or a conflict with the indigenous residents or whatever. And so these important records would be lost. And so there was a desire to have a central repository for the official record. And that's one of the reasons registries arose. So our earliest papers are actually from 1855. That's when the registry in Lowell was created. But what they did was they went back to all the records previous to that, and they extracted and hand copied all those that affected land that was in the 10 towns in the district. So the information we have goes back to 1629. That's the earliest record, and it comes right up to the present.
And are you a native born Lowellian?
I am, but I always say I spent the first 18 years of my life plotting my escape from Lowell. and it's because I grew up in the 70s, and in 1978, I think, Lowell had the highest unemployment rate in the entire country, not just in Massachusetts. But it was, one of the things we say about Lowell is that the Great Depression came early and stayed late. And it really wasn't until the late 1970s that Lowell entered its Renaissance period that we're still benefiting from now. That happened to coincide with my departure to college, and I had an ROTC scholarship, so I went in the Army for 4 years. So I was really away from the city from 76 to 84. But when I came back, I was like, yep, here I am. This is where I'm going to be. And that's really when I immersed myself in the city's history.
Well, I grew up in the Rust Belt. I grew up in Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, and so Pittsburgh area as well. So those cities kind of went through the same thing that Lowell did with the demise of the mills and the big industry, and cities like Cleveland and Akron kind of had to reinvent themselves. And I said this before, Lowell reminds me a lot of Akron in the terms there's a lot of these old mills sitting around and you got to do something with them. And so the revitalization of these mills is really, I think, kind of at the heart of a city like Lowell's revitalization.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that distinguishes Lowell from a lot of other mid-size post-industrial cities, at least in this region, is that when something is tried and doesn't work, textile manufacturing, for instance, I think people in Lowell have a tendency to try something else. It's sort of, there's that buzzword in the or phrase from the high-tech industry, fail early and fail often, because that's the only way you can succeed. And I think Lowell has constantly reinvented itself, and I think that's, it has its problems like every other place, but I think compared to other cities of its size in America, it's doing pretty well and has a pretty good story. And I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and you're known for doing all sorts of different walking tours.
Excuse me, I thought
That's somebody calling for a tour right now.
Well, you know what?
Your services, I'm sure.
No, actually, I had unplugged my phone, but I have so much. We know technology, but we haven't mastered it yet. So
Exactly.
Everything is so interconnected with Bluetooth that even though I unplugged it from the cable, it's still running through. But anyway,
walking tours, the layers of history of Lowell. It must be so much fun to be able to say, all right, something happened here in the 1800s, and now this is a coffee shop. You know.
It is, and that's one of the things I've done recently is, I think it started in 2015, was I created this thing called Lowell Walks, which are they're Saturday morning walking tours in downtown Lowell. Now, and they've been very successful. The first 3 or 4 years, we averaged 100 people per walk, which I think people who give those kind of tours will tell you, well, that's too many. But it really sort of became more of a social event than a traditional walk. And I think people just enjoyed being there. It was a good thing to do on Saturdays. I get the kind of idea for it by, I'm also the tour guide at a place called Lowell Cemetery, which is a garden-style cemetery that's modeled on Mount Auburn in Cambridge. And it was created in 1842. And it's a beautiful natural setting. And many interesting Lowellians are buried there. So I've been giving the tours since maybe 2009, and they're very popular. So I know that there's an interest in local history and the people are willing to come out and walk around. And I approached the national park about doing these summer tours. I would do them, but they would all launch from the National Park Visitor Center. So you'd have sort of the infrastructure, you'd have parking, there'd be comfort facilities, a known gathering place, but also the national park could count the attendees among their visitors if they wanted to. And the park would also assign a ranger to come with us to help with street crossings and things like that. And then what I did was I recruited people who had some subject matter expertise in different areas to give the tour. So it wasn't the same person each time, and there was some variety to it. And it just really took off. And we, as it matured, I actually have partnered with Lowell National Park to do the tours jointly. And in 2020, we had, I think, 22 different tours scheduled, going from March to October. And we got the first one off before everything canceled because of the pandemic, but we're already meeting. We might be able to do a couple this fall, but we're really going to relaunch it all in 2022.
So are there a couple of people, when you give a tour of Lowell Cemetery, are there 1 or 2 people that you just have to show people, that you have to talk about? You know, is there a couple of people that you could tell us about that are maybe your favorites that you like to show off when you're in the cemetery?
Sure. Kind of the iconic monument at Lowell Cemetery is this huge lion that's carved from marble. And it's the burying place of a guy named James C. Ayer, A-Y-E-R. He came to Lowell as really was orphaned. He grew up in Connecticut. When he was only 12 or 13, he came here because relatives lived here. And he went to work in a drugstore. He became very interested in pharmaceuticals, and he ended up with his own drugstore, and that became a medicine company. And he became the largest producer of medicine in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. And he became hugely wealthy. And later in his life, he became kind of a philanthropist. For instance, in Groton, Massachusetts, the area of Groton known as West Groton, which grew up when the Fitchburg rail line, the Boston to Fitchburg rail line became a thing. The people in that Groton Junction wanted to form their own community. So they petitioned the legislature. The legislature granted them a town charter, and Ayer donated $10,000 to them to build a town hall. And out of gratitude, the people named their new community Ayer, Massachusetts.
And I live in Ayer.
So that's where Ayer got its name from.
Yeah, I'm looking at Groton Junction down the road from my apartment right now.
So that's where it gets interesting because a couple of years later, Ayer decided to run for Congress, and the people of Ayer burned him in effigy on election night. and it's
wait, because they loved him so much, or
well, he died several years later, and his obituary in the New York Times tells you that if people think the media today is rough, it's got nothing on what it used to be. And I can quote the almost final line of his obituary. It says that his disappointment that the people he thought loved him so much rejected him caused his mind to become unhinged, and he spent his last days in a sanatorium.
Wow.
And he did. I think he had some kind of dementia or some kind of debilitating illness. But when he died, his wife hired this actually an Irish artist to carve the lion out of Italian marble, supervise its installation. And then she packed up and moved to Paris and became one of the wealthiest Americans living in Paris at the turn of the 19th century.
So why the lion?
Well, there's a couple of theories. One is that I think they sometimes use that as like for branding for the company, but he also was seen as sort of like the leader of the family. And so it's an incredible piece of artwork. It's really beautiful. So that's sort of the iconic monument. It's an interesting story. We've got others. Paul Tsongas, the former United States Senator, ran for president, is buried there. There are a number of other members of Congress. The inventor of Moxie, the soft drink, is buried in Lowell Cemetery.
Wow.
The first man and woman, his wife, to drive a car around the world are both buried there.
Wait, that's really funny because I think the first woman who was able to get a driver's license is buried in Concord
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's just, so it's sort of a combination of the beauty, the natural beauty of the place. When this cemetery was created, a lot of the wealthy residents would put a lot of money into uniquely carved monuments for themselves. And so it essentially became an outdoor art museum at a time where there were no public art museums. And so people would go on Sunday, their one day off from work, and they'd bring a picnic lunch, and they'd enjoy the natural setting, see the beautiful monuments. I think a lot of that continues today.
So we are in April of 2021. April 19th is coming up, which is the 160th anniversary of the Baltimore riots, when various Union soldiers were attacked and killed. And I believe you have two of them buried in Lowell, don't you?
We do. Their names are Addison Whitney and Luther Ladd. It's a story. I have a master's degree in history that I got after I became registered deeds. I went from working 80 hours a week as a lawyer to 40 hours a week as a government official. And so the extra time I went to Salem State at nights and got my master's. And I wrote my thesis on that group of soldiers from Massachusetts who were attacked in Baltimore. In fact, in 2011, my wife and I traveled down there for the 150th anniversary of the Baltimore riots. So we were in Baltimore that day for it. So I've sort of made a lifetime study of that.
Well, for those of our viewers who are joining us who aren't really familiar with the story, give us a synopsis of what happened in Baltimore in April of 1861, please.
Sure. April 12th, 14th, Fort Sumter's fired upon. It surrenders. President Lincoln, in response to that, calls for 75,000 volunteers from the North, well, from all over, but it was only the North that responded, to come to Washington. And for a couple of reasons, there were 4 regiments of militia from Massachusetts that were much more well-trained and prepared than their counterparts across the northern states. And the one that was the first to move out was the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which was based in Lowell. It had 8 companies, and a company's about 100 soldiers. 4 were from Lowell, 2 were from Lawrence, 1 was from Acton, and I think the other one was from Groton. They added a couple more on. They traveled by train. They went through New York City and Philadelphia, and they had to go through Baltimore to get to Washington. And the train stations in Baltimore are a little bit like the train stations in Boston. Now, if you want to take a train from Concord or Lowell to New York City, and you want to go through Boston, you arrive at North Station and you depart from South Station. Now, there are many ways to get from North Station to South Station, but train is not one of them because they're not connected together. And so in Baltimore, you arrive from the north at the President Street Station, and you depart from the Camden Station, which is where Camden Yards baseball field is now. And they're about 1.5 miles apart. And so when this unit from Massachusetts arrived, they had to dismount from the train and march through the city, essentially, to get to the next station. Well, Baltimore is a very pro-Southern city, and it was filled with a lot of Southern sympathizers, and they didn't want these troops to get through. So they barricaded the way, then they started throwing rocks, and then they started shooting at the soldiers. The soldiers returned fire. 4 of the soldiers were killed by bullets. 2 were from Lowell, a third was from Lawrence. His name was Sumner Needham. And there was a 4th named Charles Taylor, who had only joined the unit as it departed from Boston. And he never even got a uniform. He was still in civilian clothes. And in the melee and the confusion, they left him behind, and his body disappeared. And no one ever has been able to find it or know what happened to it. They collected up their wounded. They got on the train southbound, and they were the first Union unit to get to Washington, which I think people underestimate because the only soldiers in Washington at the time were of questionable loyalty. And there were a lot more Virginia militia in proximity to Washington than anybody friendly to the United States government. And so had things gone a little differently, the southern states could have very easily captured Washington, President Lincoln, and the entire cabinet. So I think getting these troops to Washington quickly was a really big thing. Now, the scale of the war, the subsequent years kind of dwarfed what happened, but certainly at the time, they were seen to have accomplished quite a lot, and the ones that were killed were called the first martyrs of the rebellion.
And Whitney and Ladd were then brought home and buried in Lowell, correct?
They were initially buried in Lowell Cemetery, but in 1865, the state and the city jointly erected a monument in their memory right in front of Lowell City Hall. It's an obelisk, and their bodies were exhumed and transferred, and they're buried there also. So it's not only a memorial to their memory; it's their graves too. It's
an absolutely beautiful monument.
Yes.
You can't miss it. It's right there. Absolutely beautiful monument. So, and of course, I would imagine when they were reburied, there was all the pomp and circumstance that a city like Lowell would put on for something like that.
There was, although there's an interesting footnote that the dedication was supposed to be on the anniversary of the riot in Baltimore, which would have been April 19th, 1865. But of course, just a few days before that, President Lincoln was assassinated. And so the ceremony was rescheduled, and it was dedicated on Bunker Hill Day, June 17th, 1865.
Nice.
And the governor was there, and General Ben Butler from Lowell, and a lot of other dignitaries.
That's great. Yeah, well, and of course in Concord, April 19th is huge for us because of the battles of Concord and Lexington. And then our Civil War monument was dedicated on April 19th, 1867. So April 19th is huge for all of us in both Concord and Lowell. It's a big day for everybody. So
the coincidence of timing was not lost on those in 1861. In fact, on the second floor of the Massachusetts State House is a big mural of the fight in Baltimore, and the caption of it specifically refers to the actions in Lexington and Concord and the connection with the volunteer soldiers from Middlesex County.
Great. That's great. So another aspect of Lowell that I'm pretty obsessed with, that I love reading about, are the Mill Girls. I think a lot of people aren't aware that they had their own publication. A lot of these girls were pretty literate and were very much involved in writing poetry and articles and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the publications of the Mill Girls?
So the primary one was called Lowell Offering, and it ran for, I think, 4 or 5 years. The model that was adopted in Lowell was because there's nobody living here. I mean, there were people living here, but there weren't enough to run the kind of large-scale factory that was created. And so the model was to go out into the New England countryside and recruit young women from the farms of New England, and to entice their fathers into allowing them to come to this city. There was a guarantee that there would be dormitory-style living, there would be strict supervision, they would go to mandatory church services, that sort of thing. And the women worked these incredible hours. It was 12 to 14 hours, really 6 days a week.
And these were textile factories, correct?
Yes, it was turning raw cotton into finished cotton cloth. It was very hard work, and it was very tiring. Yet many of them still had the energy when they got home at night to engage in cultural activities, which included writing and editing themselves and publishing. And one of the visitors to Lowell, it was in 1842, was Charles Dickens. And when he left, somebody handed him a stack of the Lowell offerings. And in his book, Notes on America, there's a whole chapter about Lowell. And he comments that the publication of the Mill Girls compared favorably to the best magazines and journals published in England. So he was impressed by them.
That's great.
Wow.
And that was really, wasn't Lowell kind of the blueprint for textile and factories all across America? Weren't a lot of the systems that they adopted the things that had started in Lowell originally, like you said, with the dormitory living and the wages and the hours and even the buildings and things like that?
Yes, that's one of the reasons there's a national park here. So the Lowell National Park has 2 themes. One is the Industrial Revolution in America, and the other one is immigration. And Lowell is important to the Industrial Revolution because it's not the first place there was a factory or a textile factory. That was in Waltham. It's not the first.
I live in Waltham, so.
Okay, I got that right.
I was happy to get that in. Yeah.
And it wasn't the first place there was a spinning done in an automated fashion. I think that was in Pawtucket, Rhode Island by Samuel Slater. But Lowell was the first time where all of the component parts came together, where the large-scale manufacturing, the power generation on a huge scale, professional management, bringing capital together, and a trained workforce that was really valued by the employer. So it was sort of like the whole system came together for the first time here in Lowell. And then it did sort of become a template for as it spread around the rest of the country.
Yeah, and since most of the mills were based on, using all of this cotton, you'd think that a lot of the people who are heavily invested in Lowell, were sort of pro-slavery. But I've heard that there was actually a strong abolitionist movement happening in Lowell at the same time.
Yes, well, in Lowell's entire reason for existence was cotton. And so there was all kinds of economic incentives to at least mind your own business about slavery. And because the owners of the mills were so dependent on Southern cotton, they would travel there often. So they had friends, they went to college with plantation owners, they intermarried. And there was sort of this acceptance that, well, slavery is not, we don't like it, but the Constitution allows it and it's there. And so there was sort of a kind of keep your mouth shut about slavery attitude. But at the same time, there arose a really strong abolitionist impetus, and many of the people behind that were the mill girls themselves. And some, like the first president of the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society was his name was Theodore Edson. He was the pastor of St. Anne's Church, which is the church that all the mill owners worshipped at. And so there was this friction really from the city's founding in 1826 right up to the Civil War that I think probably reflected the friction that arose, at least in the northern states. But I think certain things had, like, I think after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, even the most sort of the friendliest people towards the South saw that they just couldn't continue on this way. And there's a famous quote from one of the Lawrence brothers who was a big mill owner. He founded Lawrence, Massachusetts. He said, we went to bed conservative Whigs and we woke up raving abolitionists after the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Yeah, so Richard is laughing because he's actually used that quote in a lot of his lectures. And Richard, what is the exact quotes?
And so, yeah. Which then leads to post-Civil War, the immigration. I mean, Lowell is absolutely affected by the new immigrants that were coming to America in the last half of the 19th century. And Lowell is a perfect example of an immigrant city, isn't it?
Yeah, what happened was sort of almost right after Lowell was founded, competition arose. And Lowell is where it is because the Merrimack River drops 32 feet in less than a mile. And so it created the amount of hydropower necessary to drive such a large-scale enterprise. The reason that it didn't expand in Waltham was that the Charles River doesn't drop that much, and it didn't create that much hydropower. Lowell was different. But shortly after the founding, steam really became a practical means of power generation. And so you could build factories on the waterfront, like in Fall River, so that you didn't have to ship the raw material inland and the finished goods back to the port. And so this created this sort of price pressure on the Lowell mills to constantly be cutting costs. And the way to do that was to speed up the work and cut down the pay. And that really turned off the Yankee mill girls. And because they had somewhere else to live, they left. They didn't stay here. And so the mill owners started replacing them with immigrants. First, it was the Irish who came here to help build the canals and the mills. But then succeeding waves of immigrants, because they were in such desperate straits, were always willing to work for less. And so in the 1870s, the French Canadians came and they were willing to work for less than the established Irish. And then in the 1890s, it was the Greeks came and they were willing to work for less than the French were making at that time. And so it was this constant cycle of new groups coming. And they didn't really so much, at least in the entry level, they displaced sorry about that. They displaced the established workers, but
yeah, my family is Portuguese, and it's funny that you had mentioned Pawtucket because I have cousins who grew up in Pawtucket, and I know that the Portuguese came over as and worked in mills and factories. And because there's also the language barrier too, the whole idea of, you can get a job just through manual labor, and it doesn't, it's quote unquote unskilled labor, although you have to be really careful because mills are extremely dangerous. So I can imagine also just how intimidating it must be. Plus you have layer upon layer of immigrants speaking different languages, and there's all sorts of social issues and people just being uncomfortable working side by side with somebody maybe they know how much or how little they're getting paid, because these waves that you're describing, they didn't happen with a sort of a clear division. It was everything, the turnover in factories I would imagine would be very gradual. So you sort of have some French Canadians who are just going to stick to the job because just because they need it, and then the Greeks come in, and then there's still some Irish people working there, and it's a multicultural place, but it's not always the friendliest of places.
True, and that's one of the reasons why Lowell, there's been union activity in Lowell. There were strikes at the time of the Bread and Roses strikes, but it's never been, the mills were never really, the laborers were never really able to unionize among different ethnic groups. And so that, I think that's a story that needs to be explored more.
Right. And of course, the famous native son of Lowell, Jack Kerouac, is a Quebecois, and is, I think, one of the perfect examples of that kind of immigrant American. I know that Kerouac always had issues debating between the American and the Quebecois sides of him, and as a lot of immigrants do. Are you an American? Are you a French Canadian American? What are you? And it's something that a lot of our friends and family, my family was German and also Quebecois. And so they were always debating what's American and what isn't. Do we keep our old ways? Do we get rid of our old ways? Are we Americans now? It's the ongoing battle, which a lot of new immigrants are still dealing with.
Yes, definitely. But we're certainly excited about Jack Kerouac. Next year is his 100th birthday.
Yeah, I can't believe it. That's great.
So anybody who's watching who's a Kerouac fan, pay attention to what's going on in Lowell in 2022. I think there'll be a lot of interesting activities.
Exactly. And this is actually a great plug. We're doing another show with Sean Thibodeau, who's a tremendous librarian, and he's helping to organize the Kerouac Centennial. And he had mentioned, Dick, that you have a magazine coming out that's sort of based on the Dial, kind of based on that concept of the Dial, of sort of bringing a lot of different writers together.
Yes, it's so I have a website, and it's called richardhowe.com. It started as sort of a campaign website for myself, but since it's a 6-year term, there wasn't a lot to do in between. So in 2007, I turned it into a blog, back when that was a thing. And that was before there was Facebook and before there was Twitter. So, and at first it focused on Lowell history and Lowell politics. But over the last couple of years, we've changed it into more of a platform for local writers, and local in sort of a broad sense of the term. And what we're doing is we're compiling what I call the best of the blog into a print journal called the Lowell Review, which we hope to have out by the end of May of this year.
That's great.
That's very exciting. That's like having a salon, like online. You've brought this idea of like the 1800s magazine into, the modern era.
Oh, we definitely are. I mean, we never professed to be at the level of the writers of the Dial or the North American Review or any of those, but they certainly serve as inspirations and templates for what we're trying to do. And I'm fascinated with print-on-demand technology, where you create your manuscript and you upload it, and anybody who wants a book just presses a button, and a couple of days later, the book's on their front porch. I'm a big proponent of independent bookstores, but they have their business model, and I think that print on demand allows stuff that wouldn't warrant a significant print run and a big inventory on hand to get into print. Because as much as I like technology, I think paper is still the best storage means that we've got.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So what we will do when this airs, below our conversation, we will put various links that people can go to for the Lowell Review and for anything else that's going to be going on in Lowell. And you said that you're hopefully going to be starting up your walking tours again sometime this summer?
Yeah, it would be late this summer or in the fall, but we're being very cautious about it.
Right.
Because if you have 100 people on a tour, it's kind of hard to distance.
Yeah.
And we don't know where we're going to be with the pandemic. So I think it's probably safer to say that we'll come back full speed ahead in the spring of 2022.
Yeah, and I see that you have some videos on your walking tour page, so that can sort of whet people's appetite.
Yeah, so at the start of the pandemic, I did a couple of virtual tours, a couple on the Civil War, there's one on the Lowell Cemetery. So they're right on the richardhowe.com website.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, Dick, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. We could talk about Lowell forever, but it's been really great having you with us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Tammy, as usual, it was great working with you.
Exactly. And thank you everyone for watching another episode of Concord Days.